So in this video we're going to be discussing my love-hate relationship with the lock miter bit for the router table. Basically, setting it up could be a real pain, especially if you don't know what you're doing. My big tip is to set up the height first. That is a lesson I learned the hard way. I was always trying to make adjustments to the fence and the height at the same time. And if you do that, you could literally spend hours making test cuts and not get any closer to being accurate. So what I bought when I got this bit, and I've only used it probably maybe 8 times over the years, but when you do need it, it comes in handy. I got this setup block. It's the exact same size of my stock, which is 3/4 of an inch, and I use this to set up the height. Especially this time around, and before in the past, I find it's not as accurate for the fence, even though you could see I'm kind of roughly setting up the fence there. But I have micro adjustment on my fence, so I use the block to set up the height. Once the height is set, then you could go about messing with the fence. It makes this process much faster. I only played around with this for a little bit of time. I made some test cuts to show you how stuff would be off, but the final setup, once you get that reasoning down, goes pretty quickly. So in order to make sure it's set up, you could see I made a small cut on one side, flipped it over, small cut on the other side. You could rip that piece down, cross cut it, and see how that joint fits. So obviously I'm going to be using this to make a box, which is the more common thing I've seen for, but you can obviously use this, as you see here, to make flat surfaces as well. It's kind of tedious to do it that way, but I'm sure there's an application for that. Now I got it pretty close there. You could see my miters were a little bit off. And then the next tip, which is something I saw on YouTube when I first started using these, you're going to put your stock against the fence and put a straight edge against that blade. On the top and the bottom, like I'm showing here, you basically want that bit to just be shy of hitting your straight edge. And then once again, I did another test cut. We got pretty close on this one, made a few adjustments, and then I got it pretty accurate. Now I'm using hardwood, and I've used hardwood and plywood in the past for this, but what I'm using is very wide panels, and that's where the love-hate relationship comes in. Before I got it dialed in, I did a test cut on a bigger piece. You can see it, you'll think it will look good because your miters are perfect. This is an example of the fence being off, and you'll have an overhang. And I can't emphasize enough really spending the time. Have some scrap for when you milled up your lumber, or have some scrap ply for using ply, and get it dialed in, because you'll think the corners you could clamp them together and squeeze them together, and you really can't. So where the love-hate relationship comes in is I'm making a very big box, which means my panels are really wide. And the accuracy of this is dependent on the router table being extremely flat, the fence being flat, and the stock being flat. So on these wider hardwood panels, they just naturally have a little bit of a cup to them, and that is going to be the issue I have to deal with. I knew that going into it, so I prepared for it, and that's why I'm still doing test cuts. I'm doing a test cut on the scrap cutoff. This is the actual panels, but a cutoff of the edge, so I could see just how that will react. And obviously when you're not doing tests, one of these has to get sent through vertically, which is why I had scrap in the beginning to make a little bit of a safer cut, and one gets sent through flat side down. What I'm showing you here is in the middle, what happens is that miter gets messed up because it naturally pulls away from the fence. I'm going to show you how I deal with that, because shy of screwing your material to something, it's not going to work. So this is an example of an older piece I did where I had really sloppy cuts and I thought I could clamp them together. You could see some of them align, but not all of them will. And that is going to be the issue. And this is just a PSA to people that have gotten this. Spend the time to dial in all your settings. Otherwise you'll get, these were scraps. I ended up not being able to use them, but I didn't throw them out because they're solid lumber. I'm sure I could use them for something. You'll just get gaps. Parts of it will align perfectly, but then in the center you'll get gaps, and no matter how many clamps you put on it, it will not pull that joint together. So these are my 4 pieces, and you could see they are the exact same size, the exact same width. And that is going to be super important, because even without dealing with setting up the lock miter, making a mitered box, this is going to have an interior framework that will help hold everything together. But making a large miter box like this is already a little bit of a challenge. So can't emphasize enough, make sure all of your pieces are milled and perfect. And then for the vertical pieces, what I ended up doing, because there, like I said, there was a cup in these, I put a clamp on this to help flatten it out. This is the second one I'm sending through, and this did help a lot. Took a lot of that cup out of the middle, kept it flat. And then, like I said, I just have a piece of ply, double-sided tape to the bottom, because this is going through vertically. You're left with a very thin edge, so you just want some material to make that a safer cut. So once again, you can see as I get towards the middle is where I start to have an issue. I've had this issue before, and usually what I end up doing, because there's nothing you can do to flatten that out any more than what I've done, so you usually just take a rasp and just lightly remove some of that excess material. Now this is only going to work within reason. It looks quite large on the camera, but in real life that excess material is less than 1/16 of an inch. It's basically as thick as like cardstock, so you can easily remove some of that material and get that joint to fit. Now on my long pieces, I flipped around my router table, and I was using my table saw to help out with that cut. This is one of the reasons I decided to do lock miters versus just regular miters. I was going to have the same issue with miters of having a cup on my boards, so that means the miters won't join. Then I'd also have to add something like splines in there to make that joint sturdy, which is doable, but with the tools I have, it's a little bit of a pain. So the flat boards went through beautifully. You could see I have a feather board on there. I was using my table saw, which is flat, the router table, which is flat. I sent these through, all of these pieces I sent through a couple times. The first pass, I'm trying to remove the material, and then the second pass, I'm really emphasizing pushing it down to get rid of that cup. And then you can see with this one, it ended up being almost a perfect cut on all of those four sides. And then I managed to dry fit this together. There's still some cleanup to do, but for the sake of this video, I wanted to show people what the joints look like. So I'm going to take you over to the corner, which is the cleanest of the joints. Now, obviously, I haven't squared any of this up, so that will also lead to some gaps in the material. But the nicest of the joints, you can see the top fits together perfectly, and the side has little to no gap. I'm going to obviously have to make some sort of corner clamp to hold all this together. But this was one of those things where if I screwed this up, this is a lot of material I've planed down, jointed together, and a mess up on something like this is very different than a mess up in plywood, which sucks in and of itself, but on hardwood it's a real bummer. And then on the other side, you see I have some gaps in the joints, and I think once I get the rasp in there, and you can see I could close it with my hand, it's more so that, like I keep saying, these boards are not perfectly flat. And I'm interested in people's experiences with this bit and bits that you have in your shop that you don't care for. Whenever I have to use this one, I always kind of dread it.